went through them last week to see how many I covered human trafficking in, and there's about 8 of them that I cover human trafficking in, from prostitution to sex trafficking, using minors for medical experimentation, immigrant labor, slave labor, and organ trafficking. So I've covered a lot of different aspects there. One question I'd like each of our panelists to answer is, why do you write about trafficking? And my prepared answer is that I write as a way of exposing injustices, informing and educating others about what is going on in the world around them, and encouraging compassion for those who have been wronged or are commonly misjudged. We've come a long way in how we view prostitution and other forms of trafficking, but not far enough. And we need to understand that slavery and other forms of trafficking are still going on in North America today. So I will pass on. How about Rita next, and then Talena?
Sure. So I actually am not a professional writer. I do not have any published works. I am a social worker. I work in the field of anti-human trafficking. So I currently work for ACT Alberta, which is the Action Coalition on Human Trafficking. I am the manager of victim response. So my job is meeting directly with people who have experienced human trafficking firsthand, and I help connect them to resources. I help get them, just kind of connected with whatever they need. So anything, we deal with anything from labor trafficking, sex trafficking, or the forced removal of organs, if that obviously didn't happen, but they were trafficked for that purpose, we can still help them. So I'm stepping into the role of educator today. So I'm really excited to be here, but my history is, as I said, in social work. I'm currently working on my master's degree as well. I'm doing a clinical social work master's degree focusing on trauma. So that's my field and where I'm coming from, and why I got into human trafficking. It's always been something that's been very, very interesting to me. I've worked in children's services where I've seen a lot of child exploitation. And then after that, I worked in a sexual assault center where I worked once again with children within a child sexual abuse program. But now I'm working mainly with adults. So it's a bit of a change of pace for me now, but I'm happy to be doing the work that I am.
Wow. Okay. My name's Talena Winters. I'm not sure if it's going to me. Okay, good. Sorry, I'm not used to this view. My name's Talena Winters, and I am a writer, and I've been writing since 2015, and I'm not nearly as prolific as Pam, unfortunately, but I have one full-length novel called Finding Heaven that deals with human trafficking in India, and also, the main character is a victim of childhood sexual abuse. So it's not exactly trafficking, but the male character works with prostitutes who have been trafficked in Mumbai. And then I wrote a short story about a year and a half ago about a company that was supposedly researching clean energy, but was milking dragons and using trafficked people from China to do their labor. And also my current series is a young adult fantasy series, and it's set in 1799, and it deals a lot with the Atlantic slave trade. So I have some form of trafficking, I don't know, as I was kind of divvying it up in about half of what I write. So I guess it's something that's really interesting to me. And I got interested in the subject originally about almost 20 years ago after reading Memoirs of a Geisha, actually. And finding out, that's set a while ago, but it's not that long ago. And that kind of started me on the path of looking into how prevalent human trafficking still is. And since then I've read other books that deal with trafficking in modern era, both fiction and nonfiction. And I have become an advocate and a believer in organizations such as International Justice Mission, who work to end slavery around the world. And I guess for me, it's just, I grew same as Pam, actually. I just think it's not, especially when I first started writing about this, I didn't really see a lot of about it being talked about, human trafficking. So that was in 2013, 2015, somewhere in there. It didn't seem to be that prevalent, but now it's getting to be talked about more, which is exactly why I wrote what I wrote about, was to raise awareness about how pervasive it still is. And yeah, if I do ever write a sequel to Finding Heaven, it will be about the sex trafficking industry in Edmonton, actually. So I have an idea. We'll see what happens.
Excellent. Okay, so I want to go back to Rita. I was really glad that we could get Rita on the panel today, because it's important for us as writers. You know, we've done our research and so on, so we're doing the best that we can to write about human trafficking. But I wanted to get somebody who's there on the ground and who has the experience and facts at her fingertips. So I'd like to get from Rita a definition of what is human trafficking, what is the extent in Canada, in Calgary, any interesting case studies that you'd like to mention, and we'll just let you ramble on for a little while here about what is human trafficking like in Canada.
Sure. So I'm going to start, I think, just with a definition. So within my organization, we go with the United Nations Protocol on Trafficking in Persons definition, which says that human trafficking involves an action, a means, and a purpose. So there needs to be one of those conditions met in each category, and then the result is human trafficking. So an action would be anything such as transfer, harboring, transporting, receiving, recruiting somebody for human trafficking. The means by which that's done, so the threats, abduction, force, coercion, fraud, abuse of power. So how the traffickers do that. And then the purpose is always exploitation. So sexual exploitation, labor exploitation, servitude, removal of organs, domestic work, or slavery or similar practices are what we generally see under the purpose. So just, I guess as a definition, we see traffickers using a means to perform an action for an exploitative purpose. As far as the scope in Canada or in Alberta, it's really hard to define that because human trafficking is such a clandestine and underground industry that real numbers are very hard to quantify. However, we do know that it is the second largest illicit industry in the world, second only to drugs. And there are approximately 40 million victims worldwide. So it is actually quite prolific. We do see multiple forms of exploitation here in Alberta. So one of the biggest, I think, misunderstandings or misrepresentations of human trafficking is that it's just about sex. We often see anyone, anyone in the sex industry illustrated as a victim of human trafficking, which isn't necessarily true. It does need to meet that action, means, purpose requirements. But once again, there's multiple forms of exploitation that somebody who is trafficked can experience. So from our internal stats, from what we see within our organization, the clients we work with, we have about 54% are involved in sex trafficking, 41% involved in labor trafficking, and 5% some sort of mixture between labor and sex trafficking. So it is a fairly even split. I think some people are kind of surprised that it's not more just sex trafficking, but it's fairly even. Both men and women can experience both forms, both labor and sex trafficking to different extents. Within our work, we found that about 68% of labor trafficking victims are male, and about 98% of labor trafficking victims are of sex trafficking victims, are female. It is important to remember when talking about that stat, though, that men face a lot more barriers to coming forward with any sort of sexual violence, and trafficking is no different. So we suspect that there are actually more men involved in sex trafficking that we just never get the opportunity to interact with because of all those extra barriers in coming forward when it comes to sexual violence towards men. We do also find within our own statistics, once again, that trafficking is happening in both legal and illegal establishments. We find it in rural and urban settings. It is everywhere in Alberta. I don't know of a community that hasn't been affected by human trafficking. And we also see the victims of human trafficking can be Canadian citizens, visitors, temporary foreign workers, students, people with no status at all, or people who have been here for a very long time. Anyone can be affected by it. We see Canadian permanent residents, about 54% of our clients, with Indigenous people making up quite a large percent of that. In total, about 27% of our clients are male and 73% are female. And then as far as international trafficking, so trafficking from another country which has crossed a border, is about 37%. And then internal trafficking, so that's people who have started and ended in Canada, we see about 57.9%. And then the remaining 4% is some combination. So that might be somebody who was trafficked initially from another country and has crossed a border, and then has also been trafficked within Alberta or within Canada. And the last note that I have here is that trafficking can be, or traffickers can be from members of organized crime, but we also see traffickers within intimate partner relationships, friendships, family members, employers. So that, I guess, dynamic that we often kind of see in movies and things like that of, some big crime, some gang taking people off the street and throwing them in a white van and they're gone forever, just isn't really the reality of what we see when it comes to human trafficking. I also have a quote here just to kind of drive home why this is important. One of our clients said, "I felt totally minimized and not sensational enough to be part of the discussion. It is the everyday people, the everyday stories that are really important because these stories provide the nuances of the phenomena and will lead to real insight into the prevention, intervention, and restoration strategies." So I thought that was really important and impactful.
Right. Yeah. It's not all sensational stuff. It's stuff that's happening day in, day out. Yeah.
Yeah. And that is impactful to our clients because we do have people who have, maybe come over on a temporary workers visa. They're working their job and the job slowly kind of degrades into a point where they are actually being trafficked, right? It doesn't necessarily start off that way, but they've been brought over for a purpose. They've been brought over under false pretenses. And then, the pay starts to go away or the environment starts to kind of degrade to the point where they're finding themselves in a trafficking situation and they don't see themselves represented as far as a victim of trafficking. So they don't necessarily recognize that they are. So that's some work that we've been doing in my organization lately is trying to bring some awareness to the fact that it's not all just child sex trafficking. There's adults who are trafficked and there's people who are trafficked for other reasons.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you for that. And ACT is one really good resource. What are some of the other organizations and resources that you would direct writers to as they're looking for any specific information?
We do have a human trafficking hotline in Canada, which has been a really good partner for us. They have helped us coordinate clients who have wanted to maybe move to another province or get out of Alberta for whatever reason. They have connections with human trafficking organizations across Canada and obviously are very grounded in the myths and facts of what's going on here. So that's one that I would definitely recommend. If you are writing about any kind of sexual violence, there are sexual assault centers throughout Alberta. ASAS is the kind of overarching organization for that. So oh geez, I'm going to be put on the spot here. Association of Sexual Assault Centers, Alberta, I think is what they're called. But they are, once again, just a wealth of information. Here in Calgary, we work really closely with CASA, CCASA, which is the Sexual Assault Center here in Calgary. And in Edmonton, SACE is the Sexual Assault Center, which once again has a lot of really good information. Unfortunately, when it comes to labor trafficking, there's a lot less resources. And I think part of that is because it gets a lot less attention. But we, once again, do work really closely with the Temporary Foreign Workers Advisory Board. They work pretty closely with us. But yeah, definitely if anyone has any questions or wants to kind of check facts or anything, ACT Alberta is always happy to answer questions about what trafficking is and what that looks like.
Great, thank you. All right, so moving on to writing it right. So we kind of have a combined question here about who is writing it right and what misconceptions still exist in media and in people's minds. I have a couple of URLs that I'll just paste into the chat that people can look at later as they like. And I wanted to mention one book that I recently read by a very big name author. He had one line that said, you know, some people think that human trafficking only happens in third world countries. I thought, all right, you know, this guy know what he's talking about. The next part of the sentence was, but it actually happens in very remote parts of the US. Really? You know, that's not quite right. No, it happens everywhere, not just in remote places. It's happening in big cities, in urban and rural, wherever. And a couple of the books that I had down, and these do focus more on sex trafficking than slave labor, but you will see some similarities between the way that they're groomed and that kind of thing. One is The Lost Girls, a Bella DeFranco mystery. I did not write down who the author was. The other is 30 Red Dresses by Johan Twiss. That's Twiss. I'll paste those into the chat too so people can copy them down and look at them later. I know Talena said that she had some books or some resources as well. So I'll go over to you.
Sure. First of all, I read some excellent nonfiction books when I was researching that I would recommend. And these are more focused on the global sex trafficking industry because that's what I was researching for the book I was writing. This one is called Sex Trafficking Inside the Business of Modern Slavery by Siddharth Kara. And I'll do what Pam's mentioned, and I'll copy these into the chat as well. Another one is called Beyond the Soiled Curtain by David and Beth Grant. And one that I have on my shelf and I haven't gotten to read yet, but it's been really highly recommended to me, is called The Natashas, The New Global Sex Trade by Victor Malarek. And that deals with Russian sex trafficking. And also by him is another one called The Johns. So that one's really good. And then for people who are writing fiction right, I would recommend Pam Workman's books. Actually, I have read several of hers. They are they're jarring, but in a good way, and so I recommend it. One I particularly remember was Chloe from her Between the Cracks series. So I recommend that one. And you'd asked as part of this question what misconceptions still exist in media and people's minds, and I think Rita has answered this really well. And also just one thing I'd want to add, because add to the denial thing. One thing that's been happening during the pandemic is that these people, children especially, but anyone who's vulnerable in these situations are even more vulnerable. They're actually probably getting the worst of the pandemic. So anytime you think about complaining about being stuck inside, think about being stuck inside with your abuser. Because it's happening right where we are, and those people who would normally get to see eyes on the vulnerable people aren't getting to because they're stuck inside right now. And so it's even more secretive and hard to find.
Well,
Yeah.
as somebody
Oh.
on the front line, I can actually speak to that because I have seen that myself. Within especially the first few months of the pandemic, I got very few, if any, referrals where I would normally get, maybe 5 or 10 a month, right? But in the first, especially in March, April, I didn't get any. I think I got maybe 2 or 3, and that really speaks to the fact that people aren't coming into contact with service providers, and the people who might normally recognize that there's something going on there, they just weren't. I'm happy to say, well, happy. I'm glad that now we are actually seeing that uptake in referrals again. Now that people are going back out into the world, obviously it's never a good thing to get a referral, but it's good that it's being recognized and actually seen now. So sorry for interrupting. I just wanted to reiterate
that's
that
not
is true
interrupting at all. Yeah.
from my
And
perspective.
kids who school is their one safe place to go. They don't have school right now or haven't since March. And, same thing, people that would normally be able to at least get out and see a doctor or just go shopping or pass a message on to somebody, haven't had those opportunities. I'm going to go over to a couple of things in chat here. Kelly says, any resources in BC other than the BC online course? Are you aware of anything?
Deborah's Gate is actually run through the Salvation Army, but they are not a religious group at all. I know the Salvation Army kind of has that background, but Deborah's Gate is extremely knowledgeable and useful. They, just like us, deal with both sexual trafficking and labor trafficking, and they also take on male and female clients, and they are once again an organization that does hands-on frontline work. So we've worked closely with them when we've had clients who are crossing the BC Alberta border. So that's one resource I definitely recommend in BC.
Excellent, thank you. Alexandra has a book recommendation as well. She says, my friend Shanaz Nanji wrote a wonderful young adult book about a young Indian boy trafficked to Arabia into the camel trading world. Apparently this no longer occurs, maybe. In her story, his uncle sold him to work for a few years to send money home, but his passport was confiscated, so he had no way to get out of it. Okay, I'm just going to scroll down. Shanaz's book is called Ghost Boys. Okay, and Talena and I have both pasted in information on the books that we recommended.
I'm putting in the link for the International Justice Mission website as well.
Yes, good. Yeah. Okay, and Kelly's currently working on contemporary thriller where the main character uncovers and attempts to expose a local human trafficking ring. All right, thank you, Kelly. All right. So we wanted to move on to grooming. A lot of, as Rita was saying before, it's not just somebody pulling up in a white van, snatching a kid off the street, and that's trafficking. Trafficking happens with intimate partners, boyfriends, girlfriends who pull people into sex trafficking or other kinds of trafficking, family members who sell their children or their spouses or, nieces or nephews into trafficking, maybe to cover debts, maybe for other things. So let's just talk for a few minutes about grooming. Rita, particularly, how are some of the traffickers that you're seeing operating? How are they starting out and getting people involved? You did mention starting out with legitimate work and then withdrawing people's pay or that kind of thing. What are some of the other things you're seeing?
Yeah, so I think with any kind of interpersonal violence, it's usually done by somebody that person knows, right? And trafficking is really no different. Usually there is a connection to the person. So I was actually just doing some research. I'm trying to write an information booklet about specifically child sex trafficking, because that's something that's really kind of a hot button issue right now. And I found that only 1% of children who are reported missing in Canada are abducted, and of that 0.1% are abducted by a stranger. So it's very rare that you got that white van pulling up. We do see a lot of, when I talked about the action, means, and purpose, the means are generally emotional or psychological. There's not, generally speaking, a lot of, physically tying somebody up, physically beating them, those kind of things that, again, we kind of see sometimes in posters and stuff like that. It doesn't really happen that way, because that's easy for someone to see, right? It's easy to see marks on the body. It's easy to see, the marks that you would get when tying someone up, or bruises or things like that. It's not easy to see emotional abuse. So if it's let's say a boyfriend trafficking a girlfriend or something like that, it might be, this is really your only worth. This is how you can contribute to the household. And if you're not going to do this, why bother keeping you here, kind of thing. So that emotional manipulation, abuse of power, also a lot of shame. We see this maybe with international clients, for example. They came over for what they thought was legitimate work, and have then been, abused. And they're shamed. They don't want to tell their family what's going on. Maybe they're getting enough money to still send some back home, so their family doesn't need to know what's happening for them, and they'll keep doing what they need to do to make that money and to kind of save face in that way. I think one of the really common things that I see is someone coming over on, say, a temporary foreign workers permit. And then when that permit expires, the trafficker will either not renew it, or will hold it, or hold passports, for example, so that the people who've come over on these statuses, they can now say, well, you're illegal. So, which is language that I absolutely
Now
hate.
you have nowhere to go.
Right. A person can't be illegal, just to put that out there. Their status can be, they can be out of status, but a person is never illegal. A person is always a person. But they'll use that kind of language, right? You're illegal now. So what are you going to do? You're going to go to the police? The police are going to deport you, right? So they'll use threats of deportation, threats of legal action. Another thing might be getting them involved in some way. So we've actually saw this with the Jeff Epstein case, where they got the girls who they were trafficking to participate in recruiting other girls.
Yeah.
And they do that specifically so that now you're involved, right? You can't go to the police because you're part of it. You're a trafficker now too, even though we know that it's not their fault, it's a manipulation. That is something that we have seen used by traffickers to manipulate their victims.
Yeah. I've got one coming out in a few months that discusses that quite a bit as well, about, they have many different levels, and once you're working for them, then you're expected to recruit and to do your part. And they may be using threats or coercion. They may be using drug addiction and then withholding drugs, or
Right.
things like that, I'm the only person who can give you what you need. And if you want what you need, you get me somebody else. So
Absolutely.
One other thing that I don't think you mentioned, Rita, and it kind of goes into some of those other categories, but sometimes they groom victims from situations or backgrounds where others in their support group would actually view their victimization as their fault. So once the victimization has happened, they actually would lose that support, and they would have nowhere to go back to. So they would have to basically strike out on their own if they wanted to break free. And that thought is terrifying on its own.
Yeah, and especially when we see family members, for example, right? Maybe it's, let's say, an uncle, right, who runs a business, and uncle's just not going to pay you, or he's going to pay you way under minimum wage. If that person then goes to their family and says, hey, look, this is what's happening, the uncle will go back to the family and be like, oh, what a terrible person so-and-so is. They're making up these vicious lies about me. They're accusing me of trafficking when I've given them a job, I've given them a place to stay, right? So they because of that connection, because it's usually someone they know, traffickers really are able to integrate themselves into part part of that person's life in every aspect, and they really can break down those relationships. So yeah, that's a really great point.
Yeah. Well, and one thing that I was thinking about while you were talking earlier, Rita, was about that, you know, children are being trafficked by relatives without the parents even knowing it. You know, somebody helps to babysit, or somebody goes into the child's room with a camera, or whatever. You know, child pornography and other kinds of sex trafficking can be going on right under the parents' nose without them having any idea that this is going on. So that's
And
another possibility.
when that happens too, children are they're not as likely to go to their parents and tell them what's happening, because children love their parents and they don't want to make them sad or upset. So they're not as likely to go to their parents and say, hey, your brother, my uncle, has done this thing to me, because they know that their parents love their brother, right? And they know that would be really upsetting and sad.
Yeah.
So they're more likely to keep that to themselves.
Yeah, I know that it's a conversation we had with my son a number of times, was, and very, very specific. If somebody, does this, somebody does that, that's not allowed. And if somebody tells you to keep a secret, then you come tell me, because that's not allowed. And saying specifically, even if it was an uncle or an aunt, or even if it was a grandparent or one of our friends, if somebody asks you to keep a secret from us, then you come and tell us.
Yeah.
And specifically giving him permission that it didn't matter who it was. If somebody was doing, touching or making him uncomfortable or asking him to keep a secret, then he was just to let us know. And we did, in fact, later have a case where he came to us and said, this weird thing happened, and told us about what had happened to him. So we were able to head that off. So,
and it's also very important, just for parents out there who are maybe worried about this kind of thing, talk to your children about who are the safe people in their life who they can tell. So not only you, but teachers, coaches, babysitters, neighbors, family friends, aunts and uncles. The more people that they have, that they know, okay, these are the people I can talk to, the more safety is built. Because once again, they're not always likely to come to their parents first, because they love you very much and they don't want to hurt you. Another thing is giving them that opportunity to talk, right? Exactly what you said, Pam, right? Asking them about, did anything make you sad, scared, or uncomfortable? Is there anything that you want to talk to me about right now? Because children aren't likely to start conversations about things that make them sad, scared, and uncomfortable. They often need an outside factor to invite that conversation in. So those are just some really important things for anyone who is not necessarily as worried about that in your writing, but in your own life. Those are some tips that I can give you from my time in working in child sexual abuse.
Pam, I don't know. Have you been following the questions?
Yeah, I'm just looking at that now. Somebody has asked whether we can save the chat. So I'll ask our host to not close the meeting till we've had a chance to see if we can copy that text over. And we do have a question. Sorry.
I was just going to suggest, if we can't, what we can do is we can probably post these links in the WWC Facebook group.
Yeah.
And if you guys aren't on that Facebook group, that's the social aspect this weekend that we're missing from being in person. So I'd recommend go check it out.
Yeah, and I do have a post up there about this session, so we can continue to discuss there. We also have a question from Brianna on how people break free from trafficking, but I'm actually going to move on from, we want to cover some of the rest of the things on our agenda, because we've got some writing stuff to get onto and we've got 15 minutes left. So we can continue to discuss that in the Facebook group as well. So we wanted to talk about the writing craft. There are important things when you're writing about trafficking. How do you get inside people's heads? How do you write with compassion? We've talked for a minute about how a lot of the people who are involved in trafficking end up being both perpetrators and victims. So how do you write about those people and about how they feel and not shade them as only one or the other? For myself, getting inside of people's heads has actually always been one of the easiest parts of my writing. I tend to be one of those people who very empathic and get drawn into other people's heads when I don't want to be. So I'm often thinking lots of what ifs, or how does this look like? What does this look like from that person's perspective? Why would they be doing this? Why would they be acting that way? And that kind of thing. So it's actually one of the things that I find quite easy to do, and find myself, we'll discuss later about self-care, about not letting myself get pulled too deeply into some of those things. Talena, what are some of your thoughts?
Okay, well, I've got quite a few thoughts, so I'll try not to ramble on too much. Okay, so first of all, as far as the craft of getting inside people's heads, I believe this is how we should write every character. You should always be trying to see something from their perspective, just like Pam said, and that's going to make you a better storyteller. And the way you can access that for experiences you haven't experienced yourself, is you can figure out what is it, like when you're doing research, you're going to see, well, people saying, I felt so ashamed, I felt so guilty. Well, you may never have been raped or sexually abused, but I guarantee that you've been in an experience where you felt like somebody in power took advantage of you, and you felt ashamed and you felt guilty. And so you can access that common experience and extrapolate from there how to write that for your character. Okay, because the human emotions are what's common among us, and that's actually what you're wanting to access in your reader anyway. So that's going to make it a better story. As far as being compassionate, I just wanted to share this too, by the way. It was very stretching for me to get inside the head of the narcissistic abusers in my book, Finding Heaven, because it helped me to understand why they behaved the way they did. And it also helped me to extend forgiveness to some people in my own life who had treated me that way. So this is also a good, I mean, it's why we write. One of the reasons we write, right, is to develop as people. And I think we need to remember when we're writing the perpetrators that hurt people. So while our writing should not excuse those acts of hurt by any stretch, you need to understand that person's motivations to make them realistic. And so each of us is faced with the choice every day about how to handle our past pain. And we can either choose to do something positive with it or something negative with it. And perpetrators are doing something negative with their pain. So understanding which choice your characters are making makes them realistic. And often those traffickers are working inside a cultural framework or system that encourages or does not deter trafficking. Okay, such as Rita's example of the uncle who's just taking advantage of a niece or a nephew. In that family culture, that's probably somewhat acceptable. The parents are like, yeah, buck up, kid. You know what? Like, you got a job, so why are you complaining? So you got to remember that it's not just a single isolated incident. There is a system and a framework around that is allowing it to happen. And for those perpetrators, the benefits of doing the trafficking far outweigh the risks to them. So it's often difficult to access the victims as well. And one thing I wanted to really stress, especially when you're dealing with writing about sexual acts of violence of any kind, is not to use the acts of trafficking to titillate a reader, okay? Because compassion means showing the acts for their ugliness, but treating the person participating in them as a full human being with motivations to be explored. So understanding those motivations and questioning them helps us dig deeper into the problem. And my hope as a writer is if we keep digging deeper, we might someday find a way to dig out the roots and change the systems that support trafficking. So one example of something I did wrong, and I'm sure that Pam probably has some of these too, but I was fairly new as a writer when I was writing Finding Heaven. And there's a rape scene that's actually basically the challenge accepted part of the book. And I mean, I was new. I'm writing a book about sexual abuse. I didn't know the advice, don't write a rape scene. But after I heard it, I thought about it and I still decided to keep it in. And fortunately, I was going through that book with a critique group, and they were able to point out to me that what I was focusing on with that was wrong. I was focusing on the act of rape. And that's not what your reader wants to read. They don't want to read about the act of rape. And that wasn't the point that I was trying to get across. What I wanted to share with my readers was the experience of rape. And so I wanted them to have compassion and empathy for the person who was being raped, not by seeing the ugliness of it. So you want to you want your readers to feel all the fear and anger and rage and disgust that you're meant to feel, but you don't want to feel dirty yourself. Like you have to go have a shower for 5 showers maybe after you've read this part of the book. So it can be really, really difficult to write and to read these acts of violence, and especially sexual violence in a way that is not sensationalist. One technique that I use is to think of it like a movie that's like a PG-13 movie that's depicting an act of violence. So when you see those kinds of shows, like superhero shows have a lot of violence in them, and yet they're PG-13 most of the time. And so what they're not focusing on the image of a guy beating another guy's face to a pulp or pulverizing him to hammer against a wall. They are focusing on things that evoke emotion. So like you might see a shadow of the action, you might see blood dripping off, you might see like faces and hands, but you're not going to see the actual thing that's happening. And that's something I think that we can use in our writing, no matter what kind of violence we're writing about. One example I thought of that was really, really effective is in the movie Gladiator, which is an extremely violent movie. And, when I'm going to just assume you've all seen it. And if you haven't, you're going to have to go look this up. When Maximus goes home and sees his crucified family, and that's what propels him to further action. We don't see his crucified family. What we see is the feet of his family hanging down with blood dripping off of them. And we see his face through those feet and his anguish. And that is so emotionally powerful. We don't need to see the disgusting image of his family. So that's kind of what I would say is you can use that technique for no matter what you're writing, to be compassionate and to evoke the emotions that you're trying to evoke. And I recommend The Emotion Thesaurus by Angela Ackerman and Rebecca Puglisi to really start to dig deep into how you can portray those emotions in your writing.
Sorry, 6 minutes.
Okay, I will stop talking now.
those are all really great points, and I appreciate that. Our last question for the panel was on self-care, and this applies to Rita after working with these people during the day as well. Is how do you get your head back out of your work? How do you put it behind and go and deal with your family without that trauma? And it's very easy if you're putting yourself into people's heads to get stuck there and to feel their emotions, and you come out of there just feeling very traumatized. And for me, I know that if I'm writing a book that's very gritty or deals with a lot of these issues, that means that the next book that I write is going to be a lighter, more humorous book or whatever, that I've got to go and work on something else that can take my head out of it, and to realize, to see how I'm acting towards my family, or if I'm experiencing depression or that kind of thing, and to be able to step back from it and say, this didn't happen to me. So yeah.
So recognizing your own moods and what happens when you're when you're affected, right? I had a coworker who, when she was affected by something, she would obsessively clean, and that was her way of dealing with it. And she knew that if she was doing that, okay, it's time to take a step back and do some self-care. So just talking about self-care a little bit, studies of social workers have found that we all know about self-care, but knowing about self-care doesn't actually make you do it. So it has to be a conscious decision. If you're going to practice self-care, you need to actually put yourself into that mindset and decide that you're going to do it, because knowing about it does not equate to actually doing it.
No.
I'm going to try to talk quick because I'm cognizant that we only have a few minutes left. But when you're practicing self-care, it should be something that's mindful, not mind-numbing. So you should understand what you're doing, why you're doing it, and the effect that it's having on your mind and body. So some mind-numbing
So don't
stuff,
go
like,
home and get drunk.
for sure, don't get drunk. Don't, if you're coming home from work or from writing or whatever, and you're sitting in front of TV and watching Law and Order SVU for 6 hours, you're probably not, improving your situation.
Not letting it go. Yeah.
Yeah. So one way that you can tell is that things that are mind numbing, once you're done that activity, that feeling is still there, right? Whereas mindful activities, you're engaging yourself in healing or in getting better. So a lot of people do meditation or yoga as kind of mindfulness techniques. For myself, I like to, one thing I do is when I come home from work, I immediately change my clothing. It's just like a physical symbol for me of I'm taking off what's happened today and I'm putting on something that's more comfortable and that homey feeling. So that's a physical action that I do that helps me kind of recalibrate my mind. I also like to, as soon as I get home, take my dog for a walk. So I have about an hour break between.
I was going to say, go for a walk or run, do
Yeah.
something that ends your
That gives me an hour,
period.
right, between my work mind frame and my home mind frame. That causes separation. When it's not COVID times, obviously I'm breaking the rule now because I don't have a choice. But when it's not COVID, I'm very cognizant as well to have a separate space where I'm doing my work, and then that doesn't come into my living space with my family and the people that I love. There's also mindfulness techniques that I was going to talk about, such as circular breathing, 5-4-3-2-1, which or guided imagery. You can find a lot of that information on YouTube, but if you're finding yourself particularly kind of impacted by something, looking up some of those mindfulness techniques for grounding can be really, really useful.
Yeah, we can maybe put links to that in the Facebook group as well. Talena, did you have one or two things to add before we go?
Yeah, I do actually. First of all, I just want, as far as self-care, to add to what the ladies said, I just think it's really important to remember that as you're doing research like this, you're going to grieve. And it's important that you allow that process of grief to happen. It's normal. And if you don't, you're going to do the mind-numbing thing Rita suggested, and that's not going to allow you to process what's happening. You need to experience that grief in order to write this well. So do that, but give yourself that time to do it. And if you need to, walk away from that research for a little while to allow yourself that. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is sometimes that we, as writers, as fiction writers especially, you're afraid to ask for help from actual people. And I would strongly encourage you that if you want to write about trafficking and sexual violence or whatever, go find the resources that are available to you. People who work for ACT. When I was researching domestic violence, I called up my local police station, and then they connected me with the victim services unit, and I had an excellent conversation with the guy there, and it really, really helped. So most people are very, very happy to help you with your research to make sure you get it right. So please don't be afraid to ask. That is probably one of the best resources you can have.
All right, excellent. Okay, so I'm PD Workman. You can find me at pdworkman.com. I'll be watching the Facebook group. You can go to my post there on human trafficking and ask more questions or post helpful links or that kind of thing. Rita is at ACT, and Talena, you've got a website.
TalenaWinters.com, or if you can't remember how to spell my name, it's mysecretwishpublishing.com.
Okay. So that's going to wrap it up for us, guys. Oh, and Rita says ACT is at www.actalberta.org. All right, so we're going to say goodbye, and we will try to save this chat for you and post that to the Facebook group. All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you all
Bye-bye.
for coming. Thanks for
Everyone.
being
Thank
here.
you.
Yeah, it doesn't like you to copy from
Okay. So